In the new era, with the fiscal budget constraints, what impact do you see technology and innovation will have in satisfying the government demand for connectivity? Rob, if I could, I'd like for you to take lead on that question, please.
Okay, thanks very much, and it's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the overall budget environment, because I think it's particularly complicated right now and very uncertain, and that's something that I focus on. Particularly, I'm talking about the defense budget. People say that they think bipartisanship is dead in Washington. In fact, it's interesting. For the 2014 defense budget, the President, the Congress controlled by the Democrats, the Senate controlled by the Democrats, the House controlled by the Republicans, all agree on the overall number that the defense budget should be for 2014. The problem is none of them agree with what the law says it actually can be. So it's a little bit of a problem. None of them have accepted the limits of the Budget Control Act in their proposals, which basically are about $55 billion or so for the whole defense function, less than what they are proposing. So the House and the Senate authorization and appropriations committees are playing around with the numbers, but they're all playing with numbers that are too high according to the law. So if they go ahead and they pass a bill at the levels that they're talking about, we will have another sequester like we did in 2013, this sort of across-the-board peanut butter spread cut to everything. Now, the Pentagon is in the midst of something they're calling the Strategic Capabilities and Management Review, or SKIMMER or SCAMMER, as some of the people are calling the acronym. It's kind of a creative name. But basically, they are trying to say, okay, Secretary Hagel came in and said, okay, what if, in fact, we have to live within the limits of the Budget Control Act limits? What if we have to live within those? What does our defense budget actually, what do we want it to look like? How would we make the cuts strategically, recognizing U.S. national security interests, capabilities, and all those things, as opposed to this peanut butter spread approach that the law mandates, trying to figure out a smart way to do it. They're in the process right now. They've sort of done their homework, and they're briefing that to Secretary Hagel right now. They had, I think, 18 panels in the Pentagon looking at everything. So they're all sort of looking at that and trying to figure out, and they're actually going to propose an alternative budget for 2014, which is 10% below their current proposal, which would put them within the limits of the Budget Control Act. So it's going to be very interesting to see, and then what does Congress do with that? Does Congress say, well, okay, we can't solve this sequester problem that we all thought we were going to solve? The sequestration is, I like to use the analogy from the old Mel Brooks movie, Blazing Saddles, right? The sheriff put the gun to his own head and said, stop or I'll shoot. Well, Congress actually pulled the trigger for 2013. Are they going to pull that trigger again in 2014? Or are they going to at least let DOD make the cuts in a prudent, strategic way as opposed to this across the board? So that's all sort of up in the air. And the other thing that's going on that I think, and probably is somewhat directly impacting you folks, is while there's pressure on the top line for DOD budget, there's another pressure inside the DOD budget. And that is the growing cost of personnel and operations and maintenance. And the DOD budget's basically a third, right? It's personnel, it's operations and maintenance, it's procurement and R&D. And that ratio is consistent for 30 or 40 years. But those two, that O&M and those personnel costs are growing. Congress doesn't appear willing to deal with those. DOD is, particularly on the personnel side, DOD has proposed things. Full disclosure, I'm a military retiree, I get TRICARE, but DOD has proposed changes to TRICARE. They have proposed changes to personnel compensation, all of these things. The Hill wants no part of that and shoots them down every time. There's broad consensus from the strategic community and all these think tanks from right to left, all saying these areas need to be attacked, need to be looked at hard. Congress thus far has been unwilling to do so. Politically, they're very unpopular, and it's understandable. You're cutting money for the troops and stuff like that, particularly in wartime environments. So there's a lot of pressure on the budget. I mean, that's the bottom line. You have the Budget Control Act, sequestration, you have these internal costs. So you're facing a very austere budget environment. Potential, part of this should be expected. I have the chart that I use often. We fight wars, we spend a lot of money, wars end, and we bring the budget down. If you look historically, you take Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, it's about 1/3 reduction over a 7-year period. That's an average. So, it's very realistic to perceive a defense budget in real terms in 2013 dollars and about 2018 of about $500 billion. I think that's a very realistic projection. So budgets are coming down, lots of pressure. That's not all bad news, especially for you folks. We'll get into that a little bit more in some of the other questions, but I think I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Okay, Marjorie, would you also address the same question?
Sure. The way I think a lot about the budget pressures, I think about how it affects contractors, which is who I spend most of my time talking with. And both contractors and commercial businesses who work with the government or want to work with the government are saying the impact that they're seeing from budget austerity is this inability to plan. I mean, that they could normally say, well, I may not be able to sell a ton to the government, but I know I'll get this amount every year, and that was a good level of certainty. But living on these CRs, these continuing resolutions, is really starting to, I think, take a toll on the way that businesses interact with the government. That they've lost that ability to plan, they've lost that certainty that they used to have. So I think that's what's making companies think differently about their interactions with the government about future sales, because there is that level of uncertainty, which is really pushing companies to rethink the way that they interact with the government at this point.
Excellent. Thank you. Patricia, could you also add a comment to this topic?
I have a couple thoughts. The first one is no one goes willingly into change, very, very rarely. And oftentimes you wait until the very last minute when change is upon you to actually adjust. And I think that goes to this question about technology and innovation and how that can solve any kind of gap in requirements and how it can save money, increase efficiencies. I have no doubt that the industry has enormous capabilities to innovate and to adapt to evolving requirements as they're presented to them. I would guess, my prediction would be that the budget constraints will mean that fewer of those innovations will be spurred by government R&D money. The question that I am interested in is how much the government will change their thinking about industry's capabilities in innovation, solving problems, and bring them in more as a partner, as opposed to directing innovations. And here's what I want to go off and build it, looking at what industry already knows how to do in the commercial world and the consumer world, how that might affect expectations for demand, and trying to incorporate that into DOT requirements. I think that's an interesting question. And I don't think we're there yet, because I think the change isn't quite yet fully, absolutely can't get away from it. Maybe we can't really squeeze away from it all. The other point I would make that I think is a real challenge is there are plenty of solutions. There are plenty of ideas. This room is full of them. I look across and see lots of contributors to the question of how to bring efficiencies and bridge the requirements gap. The challenge is how to integrate those into the structure that has been built over time in a particular way, and integrating new technologies into existing systems and into existing procurement programs is a considerable challenge. I think one of the bright lights that I see is that increasingly, as a trade association that advocates for the satellite industry, I see government trying to understand how government can tap into industry's capabilities, asking for an exchange on how that support relationship can be something more purposeful, more planned, and capitalize on what industry can do. So if the question is, how does innovation fit into solving budget problems, it's almost everything. But the real challenge is for how you do it and how you adapt to the new world.
Excellent. Thank you, Patricia. Ron, any additional comments and thoughts?
Well, thank you again for inviting me to participate. I want to kind of echo what Patricia said, that the commercial sector in the satellite industry is very good at being innovative, doing more with less of the same. And I think the government markets really need to start embracing that culture of innovation and invention that exists in the commercial world. Inmarsat, I think, is definitely one of those prime examples of a company that's sort of taking the initiative to develop interoperable communications to what the government has already been doing, to sort of provide that innovation sky, so the terminals are cross-compatible, and they can reduce budget expenditures by their government end users. The other type of innovation that I also see needing to happen, and it's starting to develop, is innovation on the ground. and not around this in the terminal, but in the offices and procurement sectors, where commercial service providers are being brought into the conversation earlier. They're being asked, well, what do you already have? What services can you already offer me? What are your SLAs for your commercial customers? What are your committed information rights? What's your reliability history? Being able to prove that due diligence that they do every day for their commercial customers and bringing that into the government circles and having that conversation and developing that dynamic. And that's really where innovation I think will occur, is changing those types of two dynamics. So creating interoperable communications terminals, taking advantage of those technologies, and providing reforms and a tighter integration between government and industry.
Absolutely, well said. All right, thank you. So our next topic, looking at the government IT budget, where there are opportunities for some continuous funding, where do you see that relative to the commercial SATCOM offerings within the industry? And Marjorie, could you take lead on that question, please?
Sure. I want to talk, I think, more generally about some of the federal IT trends that we're seeing that I think can be sort of instructive and relevant to the satellite world. Traditionally the government was willing to fund a lot of the research and development to really take a lot of risks for the project. And I think we're seeing a shift where they're saying we don't want to take on quite as much risk. Like in commercial business, we want to buy the product ready to go. So it's not quite that extreme, but I think we are seeing some of that sort of shift in mindset. They're looking more to the commercial model of, how do they make it work, and they don't spend billions on projects that then never come to fruition as the government has. So as a result of that, we see federal IT officials saying, well, can we do smaller projects? Can we just pay for a small part, see if that works, and then we'll pay for some more, instead of saying, you have 10 years to build us this perfect system. So I think they really are looking more at sort of lessons learned from the commercial model. How can we get the kind of the most bang for our buck, right? So that is one thing we see. We also see this, this is very tied with a focus on price. So from lowest price technically acceptable is focused on just getting something that's good enough rather than the very best or the best value. We're seeing this kind of mindset shift, and I think that is really making the government think more about what the commercial sector has to offer. How does the commercial sector do its buying? And that affects really almost everything, especially IT and satellites, and saying, is there a way where we can take on less risk and just pay for what we want? We've even seen that in cloud computing, where they just want to pay for the amount they need rather than this sort of limitless amount. So I think that mindset is sort of taking hold, pushed by the budget, and that can have real consequences for the satellite industry as well.
Excellent, thank you. Rob, could you also take point on that?
Yeah, one of the things I just wanted to add about it, one of the things I've looked at a lot recently in Bloomberg government, and it's been in the news quite a bit, is the intelligence community and the spending that goes on there. Now, of course, I don't have access to the classified. I used to have a clearance. I don't have one anymore. So, but we've been able to sort of triangulate some things and figure out, and the IT budget within the intelligence community, at least in the proposals for 2014 and in 2013, is growing. So there's increasing efforts there to spend more money in IT, and that's being driven by a lot of things. But I think principally is this hot buzzword that I'm sure you've heard heard a lot lately. Like Marjorie said, there's cloud computing. The other hot one is big data, and the intelligence community is embracing big. They're getting massive streams of data, and they need to process them. I grew up as an intelligence officer in the Air Force, and it was always getting the information was the challenge. How do we collect more information? Okay, that challenge is over. Now we are swimming, and in the words of, I think, General Deptula, we are drowning in a sea of data. We have more data than we know what to do with. We need automated tools to process it. So the intelligence community is looking in that direction of getting all this information that's in there and figuring out ways, because we don't have enough analysts to look at everything, to listen to every NSA interceptor, to look at every piece of imagery. And so there is more and more investment in that area in the intelligence community, the NSA, the CIA, the service intelligence organizations, even DHS, FBI, lots more going in that direction. So that's one of the areas where I see some growth.
Excellent. Thank you. Brad, could you also add a comment?
Yeah, absolutely. When we look specifically at the satellite sector, I think we're seeing the same mindset that we see when governments go acquire cloud computing. Like, I'm going to go acquire this as a service. And that's what we're seeing trickle down in the satellite industry. I mean, there are obviously some holdouts who insist on having dedicated capacity when they manage and deal with that, those sorts of things. But we do see more of a trend to an end-to-end managed service, a capacity as a service, if you want to call it that. I mean, capacity plus type of things. But that's where we're seeing the opportunities for more funding, is being able to offer those types of end-to-end managed services, information assurance, reliability, those types of things. Another emerging trend that we're tracking in our hosted payloads, and this is more of a solution: do I acquire my own dedicated satellite, or do I, acquire an orbital slot as a service? Hosted payloads is another conversation that I think we need to start being involved in. So if we look at that, and again, managed services is really where the direction, being able to acquire that capacity plus as a service is really where we're going.
Okay, so a redirect back to you on that. Legacy has shown us that capacity has been bought separately and hardware has been bought in its own program and contract vehicles. Do you see a trend then for this enterprise level service of being integrated as a subscription offering?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you ask satellite operators and service providers playing in this space, well, where's your business coming from? Service providers can't operate on just a capacity level. So satellite operators have come down and kind of stolen that business. They've marginalized it to the point where if you're not offering more than just capacity, then you can't really play in this space. Yeah, I mean, in terms of contract vehicles, I think you see that with DISA as well, that they're consolidating those things into their contract vehicles, for kind of projects, programs of record, to be able to offer those end-to-end managed services and still accommodate people who want those capacity.
Okay, thank you. Patricia, any thoughts?
I wanted to react a little bit to Marjorie's comment about risk sharing. That's a really useful reference that I think is a good sliding scale for the challenge in the shifts, both in the underlying requirements and the way that those requirements might be addressed using other models that have traditionally been around. It's really a struggle against owning your own circuit and having complete control of direction for it, saying this is what I want, I'm not going to control, as opposed to sharing the bandwidth or writing over someone else's network. I mean, that trend towards cloud computing is relinquishing control. And I think as that gets matched with the sensitivity of the requirement, that I think is a real calibration that folks within the department I understand are trying to match up so they can take better advantage of models that are new and still retain some of the important protections that won't go away. I will say that I think successful companies in predicting this will be those that are able to evaluate not only those trends in relinquishing control and sort of more shared models, but also those that are able to leverage their experience in commercial worlds and lay on top of that either cyber or and protection requirements that are unique to government users that I don't think translate directly into our models. I do think that hosted payloads are one of the alternatives that we'll see. I think that's a very difficult relinquishing of control in a policy context for the government. I do think it makes a lot of sense and it's drawn an awful lot of attention. But I think the reason why we haven't seen a plethora of hosted payloads is not only this is relinquishing controls through that I direct and I specify, but also the challenge of fitting this hybrid model somewhere between procurement and acquisition worlds.
Excellent, thank you. All right, let's move on then to our next topic. In analyzing the 2014 budget request, and we're talking to our government users, what have been the key requirements regarding military communications needs, in particular for supporting SATCOM, and what are the best ways that industry can implement these requirements? Actually, Brad, would you take a lead on this question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we talk to customers in our government clients in our research, the requirements haven't necessarily changed that much from what was for last year. They're required to have the same sort of capacity, the same amount of panels, the same throughputs. Those types of things haven't necessarily changed. And I think there's a fear of changing those in the budget environment as it is right now, because you might be sending red flags like, oh, if I can cut this out of my program or out of my requirement, maybe there's more meat here that can be cut. And I think there's a fear of doing that. So we haven't seen requirements changing. In terms of how industry is addressing that, I think this is where, again, you get to bring in all of the wealth of experience that you have in the commercial sector. And being able to offer interoperable communications, be it through least cost routing solutions or physical kind of interoperable band-by-band type compatibility. Maybe it's we have a terminal where we bolt on another type of capacity, another type of those things to do least cost routing, to be able to meet their communications requirements, but also meet their budget requirements. Again, we see a shifting preference towards dedicated capacity, commercial capacity. And I think there's also an understanding now that people have to get by with an 80% solution or a 90% solution. That extra 10 to 20% is really where all the budget goes to. And if we can cut that away, maybe I can do my mission, maybe even do a little bit more, and then still have some money left over or be able to meet the budget requirements that are being set in this environment.
Thank you. Patricia, could you address the same topic, please?
Well, I'm not a budgetarian, so I'll just say that right away, but I do think we're able to see some significant changes in the way that the government is planning for its communications requirements. I think we're no longer planning for global escalation, but more smaller expeditionary forces that require mobility, that require flexibility, sort of an anywhere, anytime capability, using different platforms, sea and land, air, and I think all of those shifts have significant advantages for satellite. And one of the questions is the underlying demand changing? Absolutely. Is the quantity changing? Maybe the budget will be the determining factor. Certainly the nature of requirements are morphing as the missions change. What the other thing to think about is whether satellite as a platform alternative is being substituted, whether there are reasonable substitutes to think of other telecom technologies that can meet those requirements. When I look at the kinds of expeditionary aspects, these are things that satellite excels at. Mobility anywhere, anytime, any platform. These are things that are difficult to wire. These are difficult to use with terrestrial networks. These are sort of the hallmark of satellite as it's been used for public safety, for emergencies, for national security over the last 10 to 15 years. So I don't think that there's no cause for watchfulness. What I do think is that the shifts in the nature of demand have the opportunity of situating satellite solutions very, very well because they are inherently flexible. And that's what's happening. We've got to think, though, about how to make those as affordable as a terrestrial alternative that's not technically an actual alternative for that environment. That's, I think, a challenge for the industry.
Well said. Rob, any further thoughts?
I kind of want to echo what Patricia said. As we were government, I and my colleagues tried to look out beyond the 14 budget, look out over the next 10 years and say, okay, if DoD is cutting back money, whether they do away with sequester or not, the budget is coming down, where are the areas for continued investment? What are the things that are going to get cut? What are the things that are not going to get cut? And if you look at the areas where we don't think there's going to be lots of cuts, or the areas that will be relatively safe, it's things like unmanned vehicles, it's things like special operations, it's things like T4 ISR. All of these things are heavily dependent on communication. I think it's exactly as Patricia said. We're looking at smaller expeditionary forces. The 2012 strategy said we are not going to size the ground forces for long-term occupations. We're not going to do Iraq and Afghanistan again. We're not building an Army and Marine Corps structure to do those kinds of 100,000 guys, 150,000 guys on the ground in a foreign country for a long period of time. Nobody wants to do that. We want to push electrons forward and bring people home. And so all of these capabilities are going to require bandwidth. And so, I am no technical expert, but, when I was in the service and the trends that I see now is there's only going to be demand for more bandwidth, bigger pipes to push more information, those big data things, that cloud computing. Again, putting the electrons forward in the field with a few guys, pumping everything back for processing and pushing it back forward to the end user in the field. And so, I see demand for services like that and services like satellite communications. I really would expect that to continue to be very robust in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to our next topic. The US DoD is actively looking into new ways to take advantage of potential SATCOM services. So much so that this year, actually in January, Terry Takai, the US DoD CIO, actually defined a new SATCOM governance for addressing those issues. What is your advice to the industry on how we can effectively engage and establish a two-way dialogue with the US government given this new and changing market environment? Patricia, could you take lead on this one, please? Given where you just were, right?
We think a little bit about this at SIA, and those of you who are members know how much time we spend on this sort of exchange and how to be effective at it. And I think my first recommendation to industry is to show your value, show that you're trying to solve a problem, not sell a product. And I think that's a significant challenge for those of us who are designed and driven by the commercial performance of your venture. But there's a little bit of a policy overlay that you need to bring in when you're talking with government to understand what you have and how it can fit in with the challenges that are foremost in mind in the conversations you're exchanging. I think industry generally, the satellite industry has, I think, proven to be quite a trusted exchange partner with the national security community, and I think part of that comes from the service that was provided in the last two engagements and the seriousness that the industry took those requirements and handled them appropriately and effectively. But also, I think it comes from trying to think through some of the very same problems that our colleagues in government are grappling with. So I think part of our job is to remind the government of the broader world beyond just what the government buys or what the government requires or what the government stipulates, to present not only new technologies but give the federal buyer a sense of their place in the marketplace, the size of their buying power, what that means. The U.S. government is the largest buyer of satellite services. SIA just came out with data. Our annual report on the satellite industry, 7% growth, 2012 over 2011. It's a public report. Satellite services grew 5%. The U.S. government is the biggest loan buyer. It doesn't buy like a single customer. And it's only maybe 5 to 7% of the global commercial satellite services industry. It's a small buyer, but it needs to understand who they're competing with to get capacity, who else the builders of terminals are thinking of when you're developing new capabilities. And I think understanding that role in the marketplace is a useful inject for industry. It's also our job to talk about how innovation can be injected into government systems that don't change a lot and have a long market. I think those are really valuable exchanges, ones that I think SIA has been pushing for as a sort of to form a trusted platform. I always say that we don't worry about the concern that we're going to bring a single recommendation to government, because there are so many perspectives and approaches to this that consensus is our biggest worry. I will say that it's our job to trial ideas and try to situate them in the policy of the debate, not just in a sales context. And I think we've done some good work toward that. The Satellite Industry Association has been working closely with Operations Forum, Classified Forum, and Policy Forum to try and keep that dialogue formalized as well as on sort of a one-to-one basis. That's my recommendation.
Thank you. Brad, could you also address this topic, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Building on what Patricia said, who's the government competing against when it goes out to third capacity satellite services? It's competing against CNN. It's competing against oil and gas companies. It's competing against companies that are operating in remote and hostile environments would have the same sort of mission criticality in terms of their data. I mean, if an oil rig goes down, that's a pretty expensive proposition. They have to stop drilling and get its money. So being able to understand from a government perspective where the commercial satellite operator and service provider is sitting is they need to be able to close their business case. And if you're taking a long time to design your requirements, to come up with the money to buy the capacity, or if you're only buying capacity, a week or two ahead of time in the spot markets, they're gonna tend to lean more towards the commercial sector who have 3-5-year leases for their capacity, who are very predictable in terms of their needs and requirements and those types of things. So I think it builds on the statement that the commercial sector knows really well how the government works, but the government sector might not necessarily understand or appreciate the reality that the commercial industry is operating in, that they have these other requirements that they need to do.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, engaging panel. We are actually down to our last topic, and then we will follow up with some Q&A with our panelists. So, last question. The US DoD has stated that commercial satellite communications is critical to their future requirements. Our good colleagues here at Northern Sky Research have actually predicted that ComSatcom is currently about 40% of the US DoD SATCOM utilization and will increase over the next decade by 68%. With that in mind, what are your final comments on the market for commercial SATCOM communications with the U.S. government market? And Brad, if you could please take lead on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's important to put in context where those numbers came from. Those numbers came from us sitting down as a group, looking at whether or not sequestration was going to happen or not, and it did. So we are seeing a ranking down of historical growth rates in terms of the amount of capacity that they're procuring on a year-by-year basis. So it's important to say that if you look at our forecast, we always have low growth scenarios. We're starting to see the trend going from our baseline scenarios to our low growth scenarios. Now, with that, as I mentioned before, I think there's still a relative fear right now of modifying your requirements from a government and user perspective because you're in this kind of dash for cash kind of mentality. But with that, again, becomes the sort of theme of this panel, I think, is innovation. And innovation from another sort of technology that we call high-throughput satellites, which is being able to offer these frequency reuse multi-stopping architectures like Local Express, like Inmarsat, like some of the other ones that are coming online, and being able to provide higher throughputs at the same price or the same throughputs at lower price. And the whole industry, the whole government sector needs to understand that the carriers and satellite operators will always be able to sell their capacity, for the most part, there's some exceptions to that rule, to the commercial market. The commercial market is continuing to grow very well. It's a very strong buyer market, and they're not operating under a budget plus tier environment right now. So they'll always be able to sell their bandwidth to somebody else. So how does the U.S. government need to respond, or government clients in general? They need to be more flexible in terms of the time that they're procuring bandwidth. Get off the spot market and get on the longer term commitments. I realize that might not be politically viable in some cases, but you need to do that and think longer term. Overall, the future is good for the satellite industry as a whole. I mean, Patricia quoted a few numbers about where we're going in terms of capacities and revenues. But overall, the industry is going to be offering interoperable communications, least cost routing, high-throughput satellites, and ultimately, the punchline is more bits per bump. And that's what we're seeing from our side. And that's what we're thinking going forward, is how the satellite industry is going to be able to meet DoD's requirements for more bandwidth, but less money.
Thank you. Ron, could you follow up to that?
Yeah, I think, it sort of echoes some of the remarks I made earlier about the areas where the defense, overall defense budget is coming down, but continued areas of investment are probably, good for this area. One of the areas that we looked at And there's a lot of enthusiasm for continuing investment. It's a critical advantage of the United States is space in general. Everybody knows the United States is really unrivaled in its capabilities in space, and so the continued investment there. However, one of the things, and I know this from my days in the Pentagon, that you realize with space is, in space and in satellites, you often spend a lot of money over a number of years, and you've got a stack of paper on a desk for a long time before you actually start bending metal. And when we were looking for money in the Air Force budget, one of the places we would go to raid was space. Because there was a lot of money there sometimes, and we would try and raid it. Sometimes we would get pushed back because a lot of it, while it was Air Force money, it was really intelligence community money, and they wouldn't let us raid it. But we have to fight with them about that kind of thing. But so there is tension within the space budget because it is very expensive to put stuff into space. But within that framework, the big capability that provides the combat advantage, the one that everybody's focused on is the ISR capability, is getting the information. And so the communications capability, which is also critical and provided by satellites, I would see that the government may make some trade-offs there, not buying its own sort of satellites. And that probably bodes well for your industry, as it's going to have to buy that capacity elsewhere because it's not going to invest quite as much, I think, in relative terms, in building its own communications capacity because it's going to want to put that space money into the ISR collection platforms. And that would be my guess.
Excellent. Thank you. Marjorie?
Thinking about it from the perspective of sort of the traditional government satellite makers, Lockheed Martins of the world, I think, we're seeing them try to protect their turf, trying to argue that the government really needs its own custom-built versions, and that commercial just won't satisfy sort of the security needs. But I'm seeing some pushback on that from the government, saying, well, could we modify commercial satellites? What changes should we make? Maybe off the shelf doesn't work for us, but maybe there are changes we can make, and we don't need our own at every moment. So we're definitely seeing, as you said, from the national space strategy, seeing some RFIs that go out. So I think there's an interest there and an appetite there, and that sort of opens the door to, well, what can you do to sort of make it work for the government?
Excellent, thank you. Patricia, could you close out this topic for us, please?
I had a company ask me whether the government was a good customer, whether that was a sector they should go after. And, we should, all of us in the room probably already have made a decision on that because you're here. But it's an interesting question, the diffuse decision-making, annual contracts that you can't extend. There may be sort of complex and competing rationale for the underlying demand. You can't really influence demand. The budget is out. Sort of large congressional issues affect the budget. This is a complicated area for companies to play in. But I think there are a couple things that are particularly heartening for this industry. One is that we invested in infrastructure in space that is there for 15 years. That allows an enormous amount of flexibility. The industry's extraordinarily innovative, not just in developing all different kinds of new terminals, but also in managing the services and the capabilities of that high upfront fixed cost investment that is made in a spacecraft. That gives an extraordinary amount of flexibility, which is exactly what we think the department's going to need in the coming years with shifting demand and potentially alterations in that demand for budget pressures. So that, I think, is a heartening question. It doesn't mean that it's going to be very easily answered, and I don't think there's a magic avenue for companies to engage tightly with the Defense Department. I think it's a complicated customer. I will say that companies that have invested in this as a customer base, usually hire people from this community. It's familiar to them. It's not an unknown world. So they understand the complicated language and the complicated trade-offs. And that, I think, will remain a hallmark of successful companies. So that really try to understand the trade-offs that are made within the department with requirements for budget, with protection, and the complications, the difficulty that it is to plan and forecast and share those prognostications with industry partners. I think you have to guard against RFI fatigue. Keep trying, and don't just present what your capabilities are, but hope that resonate a little. But you need to explain what the investment trade-offs are, and what those risk trade-offs are, and what's an appropriate approach, because I think those paradigms are changing. And I think this industry has proven itself to be a good partner for the government, that serves us well going into these a little bit less clear times. But that, I think, serves us well, and frankly, our core business is exactly what the department is expecting to need.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we're pushing up to our time, but I would like to allow for some closing remarks from our panelists. Brad, did you have any follow-up thoughts or redirects?
Yeah, I don't know if we could stress enough commercial off-the-shelf technologies as a viable solution. And bringing those solutions to the government clients and saying, hey, this does actually solve a lot of your requirements. Being able to bolt on a component or, a stronger encryption component. I think that's one of the things where I think we're going to see a lot happening in this commercial off-the-shelf. We see a lot in modems and those types of things, and filtering down ground terminals. UAVs, I think, is a prime example of where a commercial off-the-shelf can come in and offer a very successful solution to the government, and they're not necessarily being able to compromise on too many of their requirements.
Thank you. Marjorie?
I don't have much to add. I'd love to take questions, but I do think that sort of the fundamental trend that you're hearing that I think is really relevant here is sort of, as the need goes up, sort of the need for satellites goes up, the need to transmit, to communicate from various places around the world. It's sort of an undeniable trend, and that's I think the biggest driver sort of in the favor of satellites.
Right.
Yeah, I think I would just sort of echo Marjorie and what we said here is, lately in the Bloomberg government, I've been talking a lot to a lot of audience composed of defense contractors and sort of giving them the bad news about where the budget is going. And this is an area where I don't think there is that much bad news. I think while the overall budget, yes, is coming down for all the reasons I talked about before, this particular area that you folks are all involved in, I think, it may be, as Brad said, a little bit slower growth than you might have anticipated because of that overall budget pressure. But it is growth nonetheless. And people who make fighter jets and aircraft carriers and things, I'm not telling them that there's a lot of growth in those areas. So I think you folks are relatively well positioned, even in a fairly austere budget environment.
Absolutely. Thank you. Patricia, could you close us out, please?
I've been at SI for about 5.5 years, and I would say that I am struck by the curiosity and seriousness that government policymakers have in trying to understand how they can capitalize on what industry does and does well. That exchange, I think, is more ripe than it has been in years past, and there's an opportunity for companies to take that very seriously as well, and explain your investment decisions, your R&D cycles, and understand